Hello and welcome to part 2 of my series looking at Owen Jones' latest video on the incel problem. I'm Dr. Tom Pepper, and if you haven't seen part 1, I recommend you go do that. I'm going to be making kind of a sustained argument about why the Owen Jones video was so bad. Links to that video down below. The arguments I'm going to make in this video will follow on directly from the arguments I made in part 1, so do check that out before you check out this one. If you have already seen that, just to recap, what I did in part 1 was look at how they define the term incel and concluded that it's kind of vague and shifty, but basically incels are mostly online men who are sort of aggressively anti-feminist. We also looked at the problem they identified, which was violence, because there had been a recent mass shooting in the UK, first in about 10 years, which they say is down to the incel problem, but they don't really justify what the shooting has to do with the incel problem beyond the fact that the shooter was an incel, which on its own I don't think was really sufficient. But we've looked at how they failed to define their terms and how they failed to establish that the incel problem is a problem we really need to be worried about in terms of like mass shootings. So now let's look at the solutions they pose for the problem that they didn't properly identify in part 1. Most of the actual concrete suggestions for what to do about the problem come from Maria Norris, who is the academic who's worked on terrorism bodies across Europe. She essentially states that she wants incels to be treated like a terrorism problem, and this incident specifically to be treated as a terror problem. This is because if a problem is identified as a terror threat, you can deal with it in a very different way, right? And the government can really get behind that. You can look at how a lot of airport restrictions came in after 9/11 because it's a terror thing and they just never went away, right? Or if you're a TV fan, if you watch season 2 of The Wire, you'll know the police have a problem with the port union, and the way they eventually managed to lock up most of the port union is by saying they represent a terror threat. Like, if you manage to convince the government that X, Y, or Z is a terror thing, they'll take it much more seriously, and most people will be more okay with liberties being removed in the pursuit of terror. I mean, that's normally the argument for torture, right? It's like, ooh, what if you could save a city from being exploded? Like, people will jettison at least other people's liberties in order to prevent terrorism. To make her case, she claims that the Jake Davison shooting was motivated by extremist ideology and should therefore fall under the definition of terrorism in the UK, at least. But that wasn't established. The police never found a motive. Maria Norris doesn't bring anything new to the table to show that was the motivation for the shooting, which again just came after an argument with his mother after a domestic disagreement. There was no motive found. So although he did have an extremist ideology, we know Jake Davison was an extremist on several issues, it's not clear that motivated the shooting, and so it's not clear it should be regarded as a terrorism threat. A lot of this spiel is really interesting. It's the only sort of meat in the whole topic, because she is an expert on terrorism and she does know what she's talking about, but she's not properly applying the terrorist rules in this case by her own standards. Interestingly, she does bring up, and in a negative way, she complains about how the UK treats Muslims as a result of anti-terrorist actions against Muslim terrorism. She correctly complains that it's invasive, it doesn't work. You're much more likely to annoy people by poking around in the lives of people that aren't terrorists than you are ever to catch a real terrorist. She identifies all these problems with how the government deals with Muslim terrorists, and then it's like, well, we should do the same thing with incels. And it's like, well, hang on. You're right to say there's a contradiction between the way we treat far-right terrorists and Muslim terrorists if you count Muslims as separate from far-right. Like, the government treats Muslim terrorism much more seriously, but if there's a contradiction there, shouldn't we level that contradiction by treating them both the same? It's really weird. She clearly wants to let up on Muslims because she has sympathy for Muslims, but wants to be harder on incels because she doesn't like them. So she ends up in the exact same contradiction the UK government is in, being harder on one group of people than they are on another. My consistent solution is to not treat anybody that isn't a terrorist like a terrorist. I said in the last video that it all smacked of pre-cog BS. Then if you guys have seen the film Minority Report with Tom Cruise, a classic, where the government has like a scientific method of determining who's going to be a criminal or who's going to commit a crime soon. As a result, they feel free to arrest people before they've even committed any kind of crime. And that's what all this anti-terrorism legislation smacks of to me, is trying to identify the criteria they think will lead to crime and trying to stop it before it even happens, which is completely illiberal and leads to the erosion of everyone's civil rights, because tomorrow it could be you, right? Sean Norris, who's the journalist here, is much vaguer and more wishy-washy on this question. She just points out it's a systemic issue and requires a systemic response. Yeah, me neither. She likens that to white supremacy and then says that you can't fight white supremacy unless you admit that you're in a white supremacist society and you need to accept the truth of systemic racism, which is basically like saying, well, we can't make any progress on these issues that everyone agrees are a problem unless you swallow our conception of the problem. So it's no good just trying to be not racist or trying to do anything about racism unless you're willing to accept the whole hog and say that society is systemically racist. And lots of non-racist people don't think that's the case. She thinks it's the same issue with the gender stuff. Incels are anti-feminists. We need to accept that we live in a sexist society before we can start addressing that problem. But she never actually says how the problem will be addressed once we get there. Even when Owen Jones explicitly asks them what are the practical solutions, he never gets anywhere. It's a particular problem for Sean Norris, it seems, who states that there is misogyny in the air we breathe. Which yeah, I mean, I couldn't think of a solution for that either. So that is quite a problem. Sean Norris also states in another point, and I do want to read the quote directly here. She says that men in Britain are growing up and living in a society that is telling them that they can rape women with impunity. I really hate to trivialize sexual assault or rape or anything like that, but rape is illegal in the UK. It's quite actively discouraged by the UK government. I've never heard anyone put forward any kind of pro-rape ideas. It's just not helpful for this kind of hyperbole. We're going to get nowhere. And she does get nowhere. She identifies these huge, massive, towering problems and then says nothing about how they can be solved other than some vague stuff about education. Just educate people to not breathe the sexist air, I guess. And all of this really is the combination to the argument I've been making since part one. This is why it's worrying. These people aren't people in power, but they are people of influence. And this is their reaction to a murder, is to clamp down on everyone's freedom. Murder's obviously terrible, but you're never going to get to a society that doesn't have murders in it. The UK is a society of 70 million people. But they identified a problem. And I'm aware some people might see this as the internet is calling it Hegelian dialectics. I'm pretty sure in Hegel it was a lot more complicated. But the idea is basically that people in power or influence have policies they want to see enacted. So they just find or create a problem and then act as though the policies they already wanted are the solution to that problem. So specifically here, what's happening is Owen Jones doesn't like incels. We'll look at why in the next section. He wants them to not exist online. I'm sure he doesn't mind if he still exists at home or whatever, but he doesn't want them communicating in any kind of incel-ish way online. Then this event comes along, it's a shooting by someone who's an incel, and he thinks, well, hang on a second, I can make a meal of this. I don't care about gun laws or mental health laws, so I'm not going to make an argument about that. I care about incels, so I'm going to pretend that this event never would have happened if only incels couldn't communicate online, as though there's any link between the two. So you end up with this trio of what seem like technocrats, people who think that there's an orderly, structured way you should be running society. You can do it all very officially and by the book. And there's just a good way to do things and a bad way to do things. And if people don't like the good way to do things, then you need to work around that problem. Human rights and liberty don't really come into it much in their view. You really do get the impression that these people would happily take away everyone's rights, at least their online rights, which are still kind of fresh. That still feels like something that might get taken away by the man. They essentially want to use this terrible incident to give the government more power, and then they'll just cross their fingers and hope the government will never turn that power against them. Because there's no reason that the government couldn't start doing this on socialists, right? If there's ever any violence from someone who happens to be a socialist, well, I guess socialism leads to violence. Let's crack down on that. That would make Owen Jones unhappy, but it's the exact same form and structure as the thing he's arguing for here. So hopefully I've explained why their argument fails, why they fail to establish a proper case for treating incels like terrorists or even worrying about the incel problem at all. But there is one question that I still need to address, and it is by far the most important question of all. No, I'm not joking. This is actually the most important part of the entire discussion. Is Owen Jones a cuck? Is fully what's motivating all of this treat incels as terrorists garbage rhetoric. So you may have seen it if you know anything about Owen Jones. There's been this thing floating around online for a while that in one of Owen Jones's books, he recaps how he came home one day and saw his wife, or his girlfriend, having sex with a black man, and it's that experience that turned him gay. He got cucked. Now, Owen Jones is actually gay, but that's the only part of the story that's true. He never wrote that in any of his books. Someone just wrote a paragraph in fairly convincing Owen Jones style and pretended that was in the book. Now, this has clearly wound up Owen Jones to no end, and I know it has because he talks about it in this video and in another video, links down below, when there's absolutely no reason to bring it up. In both cases, the people he's talking to just look at him like, why are you talking about this? And then have to like back out of the conversation and try to bring it back on track. He's clearly been so triggered by what he thinks are incels calling him a cuck online that now he wants to brand them as terrorists and take their rights away. That's what's happening here. It's just so incredibly obvious. He claims it's an alt-right conspiracy theory. I don't know what the conspiracy is here. I think by conspiracy theory, he just means thing that isn't true. Because again, that's all Owen Jones does. It's just find the labels people don't like, stick it to things. So obviously it's not a conspiracy theory. There's no conspiracy going on. It's just a meme, bro. In the second video, I mean, he waits about 7 minutes before bringing it up. The second video, I think he releases later, but I think was recorded before the main video I'm talking about. He just can't wait to get this thing off his chest. It's not related to the topic of incel violence at all. I genuinely can't explain, other than the fact it triggered him, what it's doing in the conversation at all. I'm bringing it up here because it's so clearly the motivation for everything that's going on. Like, he's been trolled about it online. And by the way, I sure hope that the fact of him revealing how much it annoys him means that, more people don't start winding him up online about it. That would be awful if people did that. He doesn't understand how trolls work in the slightest. But it is important if people like Owen Jones think like this. I mean, look, I'm sure that Owen Jones has written pieces for The Guardian, like a national newspaper, just off the back of things that annoyed him that day online. Because he's one of these terminally online people who thinks that social media discourse is the real world and that it all matters and it's all very important because it annoyed him that day. And he doesn't realize that all these problems would go away if he just got off social media. And if Owen Jones thinks like that, I'm sure some politicians do too. I'm sure they're online way too much. They get abused by the wrong kinds of people. Suddenly nobody has any liberty anymore because politicians got annoyed by some people online. It's becoming, that's the real problem. Is people in power and influence overreacting to stuff that happened on social media and drafting policy decisions on it. It's kind of frightening. So to wrap it up then, they don't properly define who the incels are, they don't establish a link between incel culture and the shooting, and then their solutions to it are either vague or completely hysterical. It really is the worst kind of discourse. It's about 40 minutes of these, educated, intelligent people just agreeing with each other, not realizing there's no substance to anything that they're saying, and then proposing some really harsh, draconian stuff that they know doesn't work on other cultures, so why would it work this time? No part of this video is good or worth watching, except for some of Maria Norris's talk about what terrorism laws are in the UK and how they operate, because that is her field and she's knowledgeable on that. The rest is garbage. So there we are. Thank you very much for watching. My next video is going to be kind of my own views. It always really annoys me when I watch a YouTuber and they're always criticizing other people's views without putting forward their own. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to put forward my own very broad political, social views. So watch out for that. After that stuff to be a lot more regular, I'm hoping to do some sort of introduction to British politics stuff, maybe a bit of history, cover Brexit, because I never get tired of picking that wound. Until next time, I've been Dog Tom Pepper. Please like the video if you liked it, share it with a friend if you think they'd like it, subscribe to the channel for regular updates, and of course comment down below if you've anything to add, if you liked the video, if there's anything you want to disagree with. I try to get back to all my commenters so we can get a good discussion going. But until next time, goodbye. See ya.